The sun had barely touched the horizon, painting the desert sky in streaks of fire and gold, when the first cries reached the ears of a lone Apache warrior. The wind carried a strange, urgent sound across the dusty plains, a sound that did not belong to the land or the animals that called it home. He paused, hand on the grip of his bow, eyes narrowing against the fading light. Someone was out there, struggling in desperate need. The warrior had spent countless seasons tracking prey, reading the land like an open book. But this was different. This was human, wounded, vulnerable. By the time he reached the small ravine where the sounds had led him, the figure came into view. A woman, her clothes torn and stained with blood, lay crumpled against the rocks. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, as if each gasp might be her last. Her eyes, wide and dark, flickered open, and for a moment they locked with his. Fear, confusion, and something more, something unspoken, passed between them. The warrior knelt slowly, careful not to startle her. In that instant, he realized that the desert, the sky, and even the wind itself had fallen silent, holding its breath. The woman's presence in these lands made little sense. Travelers often whispered about the dangers of the Western territories, where settlers clashed with the tribes, and the wilderness held secrets that no one dared uncover. Yet here she was, alone, clearly running from something or someone. Her hair, tangled and dusty, framed a face marked by both strength and fragility. There was a story behind her eyes, one that she had not yet told, but the warrior could sense the weight of it. He had seen many faces in his life, faces hardened by survival, faces softened by kindness, but this one carried an intensity that unsettled him. As night began to stretch its fingers over the desert, the warrior made a decision. He would not leave her here to the mercies of the land. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms, feeling the tremors that ran through her body. Each step they took back toward his camp was heavy with tension. The silence between them filled with unspoken questions. Who had done this to her? Why had she come to these lands? And what would happen when the people who sought her discovered that she had been found? The camp itself was modest, a collection of simple shelters and a fire that cast long shadows across the sand. As he laid her down gently near the warmth, he noticed the way her body reacted to the small comforts, a shiver at the firelight, a tightening of the muscles in response to the unfamiliar surroundings. He worked quickly, using his knowledge of herbs and traditional remedies to clean and dress her wounds. The task was methodical, almost ritualistic, yet his mind wandered to the uncertainty of what the night might bring. There was something in the air tension that whispered danger and revelation. Waiting for the darkness to fully take hold, she did not speak at first. Her lips moved, almost forming words, but nothing came out. The warrior watched her struggle with silence, understanding that trust was not given lightly, especially in a land where danger often wore many faces. Slowly, her breathing steadied, and for a moment she seemed almost human again, not just a wounded stranger in need. But then her eyes darted to the horizon, to the shadows beyond the firelight, and a flicker of panic returned. Something or someone was out there, and she knew it. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of distant hooves. The warrior stiffened, every sense alert. The plains were quiet now, almost too quiet, but the sound was unmistakable. They were coming. Whoever had driven her into the desert, whoever had left her bloodied and broken, was not far behind. The warrior's mind raced. There were countless ways this could end badly: ambush, capture, death, but he could not abandon her now. Not when she was so close to safety, not when he could feel the strength behind her fear as darkness settled fully. The camp seemed smaller, more vulnerable. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced across the surrounding rocks. The woman's hand brushed against his, almost involuntarily, as if seeking reassurance. The warrior could feel her tension, her terror, but also the faint glimmer of something else, hope perhaps, or relief that she was not alone. And yet, the night carried a promise of revelation, something that would shock both the warrior and anyone who might hear of what happened here. The silence was broken suddenly by a rustle, then another, as if the desert itself were alive with watchers. Her eyes widened, and she tried to rise, but the warrior held her gently, shaking his head. "Wait," he murmured, his voice steady, though his heart thumped with anticipation. "Wait and be ready." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. In the distance, shapes moved, silent and deliberate, and the air grew heavier with the promise of confrontation. She looked at him then. Really looked, and for the first time, the stories in her eyes began to unravel. Fear mingled with something else, guilt, confusion, desperation. The warrior sensed that the events leading to this night were far more complex than he could have imagined. She had come from a world he barely understood, driven by circumstances that had placed her in grave danger. Yet here she was, in the harsh lands of the West, held in the care of someone she did not know, yet who had the power to protect her. And then, without warning, a distant shout cut through the night, sharp and frantic. Her body tensed, and she gasped, clutching at the warrior as if trying to anchor herself. "They've found me," she whispered, the words trembling. The warrior's eyes narrowed. The shadowy figures on the horizon were growing closer, moving with purpose and intent. Whatever story she carried, whatever secret had brought her to these lands, it was about to collide with the harsh realities of the West. The fire crackled between them, its light highlighting the fear and determination etched on their faces. The warrior's hand rested on the hilt of his knife, muscles coiled for action. The woman clung to the edge of the firelight, caught between terror and relief, knowing that the night would not pass quietly. There was a truth waiting to be revealed, a night that would test courage, loyalty, and the very limits of survival. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the world seemed to hold its breath. The desert, the shadows, approaching figures all froze in a moment, suspended between what had happened and what was about to unfold. The woman's eyes met his once more, wide with fear and something else, something unspoken. The warrior tightened his grip, preparing for whatever would come. And in that tense silence, the desert seemed to whisper a single, haunting truth. The events of this night would shock everyone, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the darkness beyond the firelight, the unknown waited. The woman's past, the danger that had pursued her, and the choices that would be made tonight all were poised on the edge of revelation. The warrior knew that whatever happened next would change them both forever. And as the first of the shadowed figures crested the ridge, the desert night held a secret it was almost ready to reveal, leaving the world on the cusp of shock, suspense, and a story that would not soon be forgotten. The air grew heavier, the shadows darker, and the tension unbearable. The woman's breath caught in her throat, and the warrior's gaze never wavered. What happened next would test every instinct, every decision, and every heartbeat. And as the night closed in, one thing was certain. The story that began in the quiet, desolation of the plains was far from over. The shadowed figures lingered at the edge of the ridge, silent and watchful, their shapes blurred in the firelight. The woman's fingers tightened on the warrior's arm, and for a moment, the past that had led her here pressed against her like a physical weight. She had not always been a wanderer in these lands, not always a stranger running from danger. There had been a life before this night, a life of safety, familiar voices, and small comforts that now seemed almost like a dream. Yet something had shattered it. Something violent and unrelenting that had forced her into the unforgiving desert. The warrior, sensing her inner turmoil, did not speak. He had learned long ago that words could sometimes be heavier than silence, that trust was built in glances, gestures, and shared understanding rather than spoken promises. He kept his eyes on the ridge, scanning the shadows as he moved closer to her, making certain she felt protected without speaking it aloud. The fire cast flickering light across their faces, illuminating lines of fear, weariness, and determination that spoke volumes about what they had endured to reach this point. She tried to pull her mind away from the ridge, to focus on the warmth of the fire, the scent of the desert sage burning softly beside them. But her thoughts kept returning to the path that had led her here. She had been traveling through the Western Territories for days, alone, trying to stay ahead of the people who sought her. Their reasons were her own secret. a truth too dangerous to share even with the stranger who now cradled her on this cold night. Every step she had taken had been careful, deliberate, and fraught with peril, and yet somehow she had not anticipated that her journey would end with the strange, powerful presence of an Apache warrior standing between her and the unknown. The warrior's mind, sharp and disciplined, traced the patterns of the approaching figures. There was a rhythm to their movement, a silent coordination that suggested more than ordinary travelers. He had faced enemies before, men driven by greed, revenge, or fear, but this situation carried a different weight. Whatever they sought, it was not just a fleeting goal. They were relentless. They would not rest until they had found what they were looking for. The firelight seemed to pulse with the tension in the air, and the warrior could feel the pulse of the desert itself, every creature, every whisper of wind attuned to the coming storm. Her eyes wandered over the desert that stretched beyond the camp, the vast expanse of sand, rocks, and distant mesas, both beautiful and merciless. She had grown up hearing stories of these lands, tales of Apache warriors, wandering settlers, and the dangers that lay hidden beneath the sun and stars. Yet the reality was far harsher than the legends. The desert was a living test, measuring endurance, courage, and the willingness to survive when every moment threatened to undo you. And tonight, it seemed, survival would demand more than she had ever imagined. The fire popped suddenly, a sharp reminder of their vulnerability. She flinched and drew closer to the warrior, feeling the tension in his body, the quiet strength he exuded. He glanced at her, his eyes steady and assessing, and for a brief instant, she thought she saw something deeper, their curiosity, respect, and a recognition that they were now bound by circumstance in a way neither could ignore. Yet the past and the present collided in her mind, and she struggled with the realization that trust was not so easily earned, especially in a land as unpredictable as this. She remembered how it had all begun, the hurried departure from her home, the sudden violence that had torn her life apart, the faces of those who had betrayed her. She had not expected mercy, not from anyone. And yet, here she was, lying wounded beneath the watchful eyes of a man she barely knew. His presence was both frightening and comforting. The paradox of her situation weighed on her. She was protected, but still exposed. She was alive, but not free. The warrior shifted, gathering more firewood and moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived in the desert all his life. He had learned to read the subtle signs of danger, the snapping of twigs, the scent of smoke. The slightest change in wind direction, and all of it was telling him that tonight would not pass in peace. He sensed the tension in the woman's body, the unspoken questions, the stories she had yet to tell. And though he could not name them, he felt the urgency of her past pressing against the present, shaping the choices that would soon have to be made. The night deepened, stars burning coldly overhead, and the desert seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the figures continued their slow advance, careful not to reveal themselves too soon. The warrior's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a steadying presence in the uncertainty of the moment. He did not yet know who they were or why they sought her, but he understood that this night held answers that would shock both of them. Every instinct told him that the woman's story was entwined with danger, and that whatever had brought her here would not be allowed to remain hidden. Her thoughts drifted to the small details of her past life, the home she had left behind, the faces of people she could no longer trust, the decisions she had made in haste to escape. Each memory carried a sharp edge, a reminder of how quickly everything could unravel. And now, in the shadow of the desert night, with a stranger holding her close, those choices felt both distant and immediate. She understood in a way she could not yet articulate that the night's events were only the beginning, a prelude to revelations that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. The warrior finally sat back, adjusting the fire so that its glow reached her more fully. He watched her closely, reading the tension in her eyes, the subtle tremor of her hands. He had faced fear before, but this was different. The stakes were not just life and death, they were the fragile threads of trust and truth, hanging in the balance as shadows crept closer. There was a mystery here, something deeper than what met the eye. A story waiting to unfold that neither time nor distance could erase. A sudden gust of wind swept across the plains, scattering sand and carrying with it a faint scent of smoke and horses. She inhaled sharply, a warning instinct taking hold, and the warrior's eyes flicked toward the ridge. Shapes were moving now, closer, more deliberate. The figures had noticed them. They had always been watching. And now, as the desert held its breath, the night seemed to close in with a suffocating intensity. She leaned slightly into him, almost instinctively, and he could feel the rapid beat of her heart. The desert around them was silent, except for the fire. But the tension was tangible, a living presence pressing in from all sides. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every whisper of wind could carry news of danger. And yet, amid the fear, there was something else, a recognition that they were not entirely alone. That survival might hinge on a bond forged in the face of uncertainty. Her mind returned to questions she had not dared to voice. Who was this warrior, and why had he saved her? What secrets did he carry beneath his calm exterior, and could she trust him with hers? The past, the present, and the unknown future pressed together in a tight, inescapable knot, each moment stretching longer under the weight of expectation. The approaching figures on the ridge were more than a threat. They were a reminder that the world beyond this small circle of fire was as relentless as it was unpredictable. The fire flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows that danced across their faces. Her eyes met his once more, searching, questioning, weighing whether this stranger could be the difference between survival and despair. The warrior did not speak, but his gaze conveyed understanding, patience, and readiness. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together for the moment, held by circumstance if not by complete trust. And still, the ridge remained a silent, looming presence in the distance, the unknown watching, waiting. The woman's past had caught up with her, and the desert night held the promise of revelation, confrontation, and shock. Neither of them could know what the coming hours would bring, but both could feel that the story of this night, the story of danger, courage, and human resilience was only beginning. The wind rose again, carrying whispers of movement across the plains. The firelight quivered, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the depth of her fear, the uncertainty of the moment, and the strange reliance she felt on the warrior beside her. And as the distant figures crept closer, as the desert night pressed against them with the weight of hidden threats, one thing was certain: the events of this night would reveal secrets that neither of them could have anticipated, and the truth waiting in the shadows would shock everyone who heard it. The woman's breath caught as a shadow fell across the firelight. The first real movement from the figures on the ridge. The warrior shifted, tensing, ready for whatever was about to descend upon them. The desert night held its silence, but the tension was almost unbearable. Every heartbeat a countdown, every flicker of the flames a warning. In that moment, past, present, and future converged. In the story of a wounded woman, in the Apache warrior who found her, teetered on the edge of revelation, danger, and the unknown. The ridge held its shadows like a secret, and the figures lingered there, unmoving but unmistakably alive, their intentions hidden beneath layers of darkness. The woman pressed herself closer to the warrior, her pulse a rapid drumbeat she couldn't quiet. She wanted to speak, to explain who she was and why they were after her, but words failed her. The story she carried was dangerous. Revealing, it could bring them all into peril. The Apache warrior sensed her hesitation and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. His touch was a silent promise that, for now, he would bear the danger alongside her. The desert night seemed to grow heavier, every wind that swept across the plains carrying whispers of movement. Somewhere beyond the ridge, horses shifted, hooves silent against the sand, and the faint glint of metal reflected the firelight. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Whoever these pursuers were, they were organized, patient, and ruthless. They had been tracking her for days, following clues invisible to anyone but the most perceptive. And now that they had almost closed the distance, the threat was immediate. The woman swallowed hard, her mind racing through the events that had brought her to this point. She had thought she could escape, that the vastness of the West could hide her, But she had underestimated the reach of those who wanted her found. Memories flickered through her mind, each sharper than the last. She recalled the sudden attack in the settlement she had fled. The flash of violence, the voices that had called for her capture. She had run blindly into the desert, trusting only that instinct and the harsh land could keep her alive. And now, as the shadowed figures drew closer, she understood that the world outside the firelight had a persistence she could not ignore. She had survived by hiding, by moving quickly, and by refusing to trust anyone. Yet here she was, lying beside a stranger, forced to rely on someone she barely knew to protect her from a danger she could not yet name. The warrior shifted, scanning the horizon as he assessed the ridge again. His instincts told him that these pursuers were not just ordinary travelers or bandits. There was a strategy to their movements, a patience and precision that suggested knowledge of the land and the people they sought. He glanced at the woman, noting the tension in her hands, the tightness around her jaw. She was stronger than she appeared, but fear was beginning to fray her control. He wanted to speak, to reassure her, but he knew that caution was more important than words. One wrong sound, one rash movement, and the night could turn violent in an instant. Meanwhile, in the flickering shadows beyond the ridge, the pursuers paused. From their perspective, the fire in the small camp was a glowing target, as a signal that their quarry was not entirely unaware of danger. Among them, whispers passed quickly, voices low but urgent, carrying the weight of orders and secrets. They had been given instructions to find the woman, to retrieve her at any cost, and failure was not an option. Some of the figures were familiar with desert survival, able to move silently and avoid detection. Others relied on weapons and intimidation, knowing that the wilderness could be both ally and enemy. The night was a test, and they were prepared to see it through. Back at the fire, the woman's mind traced back to the people who had sent them. She had known, in the moment she fled, that there was no turning back, no plea that could reach them. Their reach was long, their patience unyielding. She had hidden in abandoned huts, moved through rocky passes, and slept under the stars, always listening for the sound of pursuit. And now, as she felt the heat of the fire against her bruised skin, she realized the reality she had tried to ignore. She could not outrun this danger forever. The warrior spoke quietly at last, his voice calm but firm. "They are coming closer. We must be ready." She nodded, unable to form words, and felt a flicker of relief at his clarity. He began preparing the small camp, moving with precise motions, adjusting the fire, placing herbs and sharpened sticks in positions that could serve as warnings or defense. It was clear to him that a confrontation was imminent, and he refused to leave anything to chance. The woman watched him, marveling at his efficiency, at the way he read the night as if it were a map etched in wind and sand. Her own thoughts shifted to what awaited if the pursuers breached the camp. She had no weapons, no means to defend herself beyond the warrior's protection. She felt vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated, and the weight of her dependency pressed against her chest. Yet amidst the fear, there was also a strange sense of clarity. For the first time since her flight, she was not alone. Someone stood beside her who understood the desert, who understood the stakes, and whose strength was a tether in the chaos of the night. The figures on the ridge moved again, silent shadows against the stars. They split into smaller groups, testing the perimeter, circling with care, trying to gauge the camp without revealing themselves fully. One figure paused and raised a hand, signaling the others. The woman's eyes followed the subtle movements, recognizing a precision that was unnerving. The warrior noticed it too, and the tension between them thickened. They had been pursued across harsh land, and now the danger was near, ready to test courage, strategy, and resolve as the wind carried the faint sound of hooves and soft voices closer. The woman remembered the small personal connections she had lost along the way, people she had trusted, allies who had turned their backs, and moments of kindness that had been snatched away by the sudden violence that drove her into the desert. Each memory sharpened her resolve to survive, even as fear gnawed at her. She realized that her story was not just about fleeing, it was about confronting what had forced her into the wilderness and finding a way to endure when the odds were stacked against her. The warrior prepared quietly. Moving around the fire with precise efficiency, he checked his weapons, adjusted the fire to create shifting shadows that might obscure their positions, and listened. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind, every shifting shadow carried meaning. He could sense that the night would demand more than courage. It would demand patience, cunning, and the ability to read danger before it arrived. He glanced at the woman, who now met his gaze steadily, fear tempered by determination. She was learning, silently, that survival required more than flight. It required understanding the enemy, the land, and oneself, from beyond the ridge. The figures watched, waiting for the right moment. Their intentions were unclear, but their purpose was singular. They were professionals, trained to follow, to observe, to strike at the precise moment. They had not anticipated the presence of the warrior, however, and that altered the balance. The night's tension thickened as both sides readied themselves. Each aware that the next hours could change the course of events dramatically, the woman's mind wandered to the mysteries that had led her here. Who were these pursuers? What had they truly wanted from her? And why had the warrior chosen to intervene when so many others might have turned away? Her questions remained unspoken, but the urgency of finding answers pressed against her, mingling with fear and the growing recognition that the desert night held truths that could shock everyone when revealed. The wind rose again, carrying sand and the faint scent of sage and smoke. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows over the rocky terrain. The warrior shifted slightly, keeping his body low, his eyes tracing the ridge with careful calculation. He could feel the tension in the woman beside him, the silent questions, the weight of her past pressing into the present. And he knew, with a certainty born of experience, that this night would reveal things that could not be undone, that would forever alter both their lives. The figures on the ridge moved closer, careful, deliberate, testing their approach. The woman's chest tightened as she noticed the precision of their movements, the silent signals passing between them. She felt a surge of fear, but also a flicker of determination. She had survived thus far, and she would survive tonight, whatever it demanded. Yet the uncertainty gnawed at her. Who were these people, and how far were they willing to go to retrieve her? The warrior finally knelt beside the fire, adjusting the glow to create a pattern of shadows that might obscure them. His hand brushed against hers, a quiet reassurance that they faced the coming danger together. He understood her fear, but he also understood the necessity of patience and observation. The night was long and the desert unforgiving, but they had a moment now to prepare, to gather strength, and to anticipate the storm that would soon descend. The wind carried a new sound, a subtle shift that indicated movement from beyond the ridge. The woman's eyes widened, and she leaned slightly closer to the warrior. He tightened his grip subtly, signaling vigilance without alarm. Every sense was alert, every heartbeat a countdown. The night was alive with possibilities, and each shadow held potential danger. They waited, silent and tense, knowing that whatever happened next would define the rest of their journey. Time seemed to stretch, every second heavy with anticipation. The desert night held its secrets tightly, and the ridge remained an ominous presence, hiding intentions and truths. The woman's past, the warrior's knowledge, and the approaching danger converged in the firelight, forming a fragile, tense moment that could erupt into chaos at any instant. And as the stars shone coldly above, the story of a wounded woman and the Apache warrior who had found her continued to unfold, suspense threading through every breath, every glance, and every shadow that moved across the endless desert. The distant shapes on the ridge shifted again. Closer now, but still cautious. The night held a fragile balance, a moment suspended between what had already happened and the revelations that waited just beyond reach. And in that tense stillness, both the woman and the warrior understood the truth. This was only the beginning. The conflict, the danger, and the mystery were far from resolved. And whatever happened next would carry consequences neither of them could yet imagine. The ridge seemed impossibly close now, the dark shapes moving with the precision of hunters who had done this before. The woman pressed herself against the ground, her body trembling, but not from the cold. Every nerve in her body was taut, her instincts screaming that the danger was almost upon them. The Apache warrior shifted beside her, low and silent, his eyes fixed on the ridge. He could feel the tension in the air, the way the desert itself seemed to lean toward the approaching threat. He had faced enemies in the past, but there was something different about this night. Something personal. Something that made the coming confrontation more than just survival. It carried stakes that neither of them could yet name. The woman's mind raced, a flurry of memories and fears colliding with the present. She thought of the settlement she had left, the people who had betrayed her, and the violence that had forced her into flight. She had survived by keeping ahead of danger, by reading the land, and trusting only her instincts. Yet here, under the shadowed desert sky, she was forced to rely on someone else. The warrior beside her was silent, but his presence carried authority, calm, and the kind of strength that made her want to trust him even as the unknown threatened to engulf them both. A sudden rustle carried across the plains, soft but deliberate, and she froze. The warrior's hand brushed hers, a subtle signal to stay still. From the ridge, a low murmur passed between the shadowed figures. They were close now, but careful, measuring each step, testing their approach. The night was alive with suspense, every sound magnified in the stillness, every shadow a potential danger. Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared it might give them away, and she clenched her fists into the sand. Trying to steady herself, the warrior's eyes never left the ridge. He could see the faint outlines of faces, the glint of metal from weapons, and the deliberate movements of a group that knew how to hunt. They were not mere bandits or wandering raiders. They were organized, relentless, and skilled. He had faced many threats in the desert before, but there was a tension in this encounter, unlike anything he had felt. It was as if the very land knew the danger and held its breath in anticipation. She thought back to the journey that had brought her here, every step a testament to her will to survive. She remembered the narrow passes, the nights sleeping under the stars, the moments of fear that had nearly broken her resolve. And yet, despite every instinct to flee, she now realized she could not escape this. The ridge was only the beginning. What waited beyond it would demand every ounce of courage she possessed. And the realization sent a chill through her body that had nothing to do with the desert cold. The wind rose again, scattering sand across the firelight and carrying a faint scent of smoke. The warrior adjusted the fire, shifting its glow so that it cast uneven shadows across the camp, hiding their position as much as possible. He checked his weapons again, each movement deliberate, his mind racing through potential strategies. The figures on the ridge were patient, calculating, but he had experience and knowledge that could level the field. Still, he understood that this night was dangerous in a way that went beyond skill or preparation. It was personal, intimate, and unpredictable. Her breathing caught when a single figure detached from the others on the ridge, moving carefully down toward the camp. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, merging with the dark terrain. The warrior's hand tightened on his knife, his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. He knew that one wrong move could trigger violence, and he also knew that hesitation could be fatal. The woman's fingers trembled against his arm, and he gave her a subtle nod, grounding her in the present while preparing for the unknown. The figure on the ridge paused, scanning the camp, and then motioned back to the others. The night stretched long, each second heavy with tension. The woman could feel the weight of the desert pressing in around them, the way the silence seemed to amplify every footfall, every breath, every rustle of cloth or sand. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to find answers that might make sense of the chaos surrounding her. But she knew that speaking now could expose them, that the night demanded patience, silence, and an awareness of every shadow. The warrior shifted slightly, leaning toward her, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay close. Watch. Wait. Don't make a sound until I tell you." His words carried authority, but also reassurance, and she took a shaky breath, allowing herself to focus on him rather than the encroaching danger. The ridge was alive with threat now, and every second brought them closer to confrontation. She could see the figures splitting into smaller groups, testing the perimeter, moving like shadows that might dissolve into the desert itself. Her mind flashed back again. 2 people she had trusted, 2 mistakes that had led her into this night, and to the realization that survival was no longer just her responsibility. She had to rely on the warrior beside her, on his knowledge, instincts, and strength. It was an unfamiliar feeling, this reliance on another, and it was both comforting and terrifying. The desert was unforgiving, the night relentless, the ridge looming like a dark promise of what was to come. From the ridge, a sudden movement caught the woman's eye. A figure slipped closer, careful and deliberate. But something about the way they moved betrayed impatience, a barely contained aggression. The warrior's gaze followed hers, and he recognized the subtle cues of someone who had come not just to observe but to act. He shifted silently, positioning himself between the fire and the approaching threat, creating a barrier of both light and shadow. The woman's hands tightened in his, instinctively seeking protection, and he felt the unspoken tension radiating from her. The desert around them seemed to grow darker, heavier, as if it too were aware of what was about to unfold. The ridge, the shadows, the windall were charged with anticipation. The warrior's senses were on high alert, every muscle ready for action, every instinct attuned to the possibility of attack. The woman, though terrified, felt a strange surge of determination. She had survived thus far, and she would not falter now. The night demanded courage, and she would find it, even if it came in trembling. Silent bursts. Another figure moved down the ridge, closer to the firelight, and the tension in the camp grew almost unbearable. The woman could hear the distant murmur of voices, low and urgent, carrying the weight of strategy and intent. They were professionals, she realized, trained in pursuit and relentless in their goal. The warrior shifted again, preparing for any sudden move. Every motion deliberate and careful, his eyes never leaving the ridge. He knew that the smallest mistake could ignite chaos, and yet he could feel the threads of fate tightening, pulling them toward a confrontation that could not be avoided. The woman's thoughts flickered to what lay beyond this night. The people chasing her had motives she did not fully understand, motives that had shaped the past and threatened the present. She had fled blindly, but the desert had tested her, trained her, and now the true trial was here. The warrior beside her was more than protection. He was a guide, a steady presence in the midst of uncertainty, and she clung to that, even as fear and anticipation churned inside her. The firelight shifted with the wind, casting long, flickering shadows over their small camp. The figures on the ridge were closer now, moving with calculated patience, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The woman's pulse raced as she realized the full scope of the danger. This was no ordinary pursuit. The night had become a test of survival, strategy, and human will, and she, wounded and desperate, was at its center. Suddenly, a distant shout echoed across the plains, sharp and urgent. The woman flinched, and the warrior's eyes snapped to the ridge. The figures reacted immediately, breaking their careful formation, moving faster toward the firelight. The tension exploded in an instant, long hours of suspense, giving way to the imminent collision of predator and prey, hunter and hunted. Every shadow seemed alive now, every whisper of wind a possible threat. The woman's breath caught as the reality of the confrontation pressed down on her. The warrior's grip tightened on her hand, anchoring her as much as himself. He rose slightly, positioning his body to shield her, every muscle coiled for sudden movement. The desert night had become a stage, and the approaching figures were moving with lethal intent. The woman's fear surged, mingling with the strange exhilaration of survival, the adrenaline sharpening every sense. The ridge had been a distant threat before, but now it was here, almost upon them. And the firelight revealed glimpses of the pursuers' faces, their determination, and the glint of weapons ready for action. The wind carried the sound of their approach closer, the desert holding its breath along with the 2 at the camp. The woman pressed closer to the warrior, her mind a whirlwind of fear, memories, and unspoken questions. The night had become a crucible, and they were both caught in it, forced to navigate danger, strategy, and the unknown. Every shadow could hide a threat, every rustle of sand a signal of intent. The ridge had loomed for hours, a dark promise, and now it was about to deliver. A sudden movement from the ridge caught the warrior's eye. One figure broke from the others, running toward them with startling speed. He reacted instantly, shifting to intercept every muscle ready for action. The woman gasped, gripping his arm, and the desert night seemed to pulse with energy, anticipation, and the promise of chaos. The climax of the night was approaching, the collision of forces inevitable, and the story of the wounded woman and the Apache warrior who had found her teetered on the edge of revelation, danger and shock. The shadows of the desert shifted with every heartbeat. The fire flickered violently, casting the camp in uncertain light. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, determination, and the realization that nothing could prepare her for what was about to unfold. The warrior's body was tense, ready, and every instinct told him that the night would demand everything they had. The ridge was no longer a distant threat. It was here, alive, and the confrontation that had been building for hours was about to ignite in a storm that could change everything. The wind howled, carrying the scents of sand, sage, and distant smoke. The figures approached, careful but swift, their presence undeniable. The woman's chest tightened as she realized that the moment they had been preparing for had arrived. The warrior's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, and she understood that their survival would depend on courage, wit, and trust in each other. The night had reached its peak, the suspense unbearable, and the climax of their story was seconds away, hanging on the edge of action, danger. In revelation, the first figure reached the edge of the firelight, and the tension that had gripped the desert night snapped into action. The warrior moved with practiced precision, positioning himself between the woman and the approaching threat. His eyes were sharp, reading each movement, anticipating every possible strike. The woman instinctively pressed closer to him, her heart racing, fear and adrenaline colliding in a powerful rush. For a moment, time itself seemed to slow. The shadows of the ridge merged with the firelight, blurring the line between danger and safety, and every breath carried the weight of survival. The pursuers halted abruptly. Realizing that the camp was not as undefended as they had assumed, the warrior's presence was commanding, a quiet force that radiated authority and confidence. His gaze never wavered, and the woman could feel the strength in his posture, strength born of years navigating the harsh, unforgiving desert. The leader among the figures stepped forward, a man whose face carried both impatience and grudging respect. He spoke in a low, measured voice, a challenge wrapped in politeness. Testing the boundaries of what the warrior would allow, the warrior responded with a calm steadiness that startled the woman. He did not raise his voice, but every word carried the weight of conviction. He demanded to know why they were here, and the man hesitated, as if confronted with the unexpected. Slowly, the truth began to surface. The woman's pursuers were part of a group that had been misled by rumors, believing that she held knowledge of something valuable, something they could not access without her. Their intention had been to capture her, but the warrior's presence shifted the balance. The desert, the fire, and the stars seemed to bear witness to this negotiation. A quiet reckoning in the middle of a night filled with tension. As the story unfolded, the woman felt a strange sense of release. The mystery of why they had chased her for days, the fear that had driven every action, now began to unravel. She realized that the danger had been magnified by assumption and misunderstanding, and that her survival depended not only on her instincts, but also on the choices she made in this crucial moment. The warrior remained steadfast beside her, a protector and an anchor, ensuring that neither desperation nor fear dictated the outcome. The night was still tense, but the urgency began to shift toward resolution. The pursuers, recognizing the futility of violence against someone as capable and prepared as the warrior, slowly withdrew, leaving only the quiet desert behind. The woman exhaled, a sound she had not realized she had been holding, and felt the weight of the past few days lift slightly from her shoulders. She glanced at the warrior, whose eyes reflected the calm that came from experience and understanding. She felt gratitude, yes, but also a deeper realization that this night had changed her in ways she could not yet articulate as the ridge faded into the distance. The desert seemed to exhale along with her. The warrior finally relaxed slightly, sitting beside the fire, though his eyes remained vigilant. He offered her a small nod, a gesture that communicated both safety and encouragement. The woman's wounds had been tended carefully, and she could feel strength returning to her body. Each movement, each breath, carried a reminder that she had survived not just by chance, but by courage, quick thinking, and the unexpected support of someone who understood the land and the dangers it held. The night slowly yielded to dawn. The first light casting warm hues across the plains, the woman watched the horizon, reflecting on the lessons of the night. She had learned the fragility of safety, the importance of trust, and the resilience that comes from facing fear directly. Her past still lingered, but the clarity of the desert and the unwavering presence of the warrior had given her a perspective she had not anticipated. She realized that survival was not just about fleeing danger, it was about understanding it, confronting it, and finding the strength to endure. The warrior, sensing her contemplation, spoke quietly. He reminded her that the desert had a way of testing every traveler, revealing not only danger, but also the resilience within. He spoke of patience, awareness, and the necessity of choosing allies wisely. The woman listened. Understanding that the night's events had offered more than survival, they had provided insight, courage, and a framework for navigating a world that could often be merciless as they prepared to leave the camp. The woman noticed the subtle changes in herself. Her posture carried more confidence. Her gaze was steadier, and the fear that had dominated her thoughts was tempered by experience and reflection. She had faced uncertainty, pursued danger, and confronted the unknown. And though the scars of the night would remain, she understood that they were marks of strength rather than weakness. The warrior observed her quietly, noting the transformation with a sense of approval that required no words. The desert around them was awakening, the wind carrying the scents of sand, sage, and distant mountains. They moved slowly, cautiously, each step deliberate as they left the fire behind. The ridge receded in the distance, a reminder of the dangers that had pressed so close, but also of the resilience that had carried them through. The woman felt a quiet sense of gratitude, not only for the warrior's protection, but also for the clarity the night had provided. She understood that the past could not be erased, but it could be navigated, endured, and ultimately learned from as they walked. The warrior shared small stories of the desert, of survival, and of the lessons that the land itself imparted. The woman listened, realizing that knowledge and awareness were as important as strength and courage. The night had tested them both, and in the process, they had gained insight, perspective, and a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. The desert was still vast and unpredictable, but they had proven that even in the face of relentless pursuit, strategy, patience, and courage could prevail. She thought about the people who had pursued her, the misunderstandings and assumptions that had driven their actions, and the way the warrior's presence had altered the outcome. The night had been a crucible, revealing the fragility and strength of human nature, the consequences of fear and the power of trust. She understood that life in the Western territories demanded constant vigilance, courage, and the willingness to act decisively when circumstances required it. The lessons were clear, hard-won, and unforgettable. By mid-morning, the sun was climbing higher, casting the desert in bright, unforgiving light. The woman and the warrior found a small, sheltered valley where they could rest and reflect. She allowed herself to sit quietly, letting the warmth of the sun seep into her tired body, feeling a mixture of relief and contemplation. The night had tested her limits, but it had also shown her that even in the harshest circumstances, human resilience and connection could prevail. The warrior prepared a simple meal, sharing it with her as they spoke quietly of what had occurred. The woman asked questions, and he answered with measured care, explaining the lessons of the desert, the importance of awareness, and the subtle ways in which trust could be earned and tested. She realized that this night, though filled with danger and fear, had provided clarity and perspective. Every movement, every decision, every choice had mattered, shaping the outcome and leaving an imprint that would guide her in the days ahead as the day progressed. The woman reflected on the broader lessons of the ordeal. The desert, the ridge, the pursuers, and the warrior had all played roles in a story of survival, courage, and human resilience. She understood that fear was natural, but it did not have to dictate actions. Strategy, observation, and trust were just as important as instinct and strength. The night had been a test, a challenge that had revealed not only the dangers of the Western territories, but also the strength and determination that resided within her. The warrior watched her quietly. Noting the change in her demeanor, she had faced danger and fear, had confronted uncertainty, and had survived. The lessons were clear. In a world filled with unpredictability, the ability to remain aware, make careful decisions, and trust in the right people could mean the difference between life and death. He recognized the growth in her, the resilience that had been tempered and strengthened by the night's events as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Painting the desert in golden hues, the woman and the warrior prepared to move onward. The ridge was behind them. The night's danger dissipated, and the desert once again stretched endlessly before them. She felt a sense of accomplishment, understanding that the challenges she had faced were not just physical but deeply personal. She had learned to confront fear, trust in her own judgment, and rely on the strength of allies when necessary. The warrior led the way with quiet confidence, and she followed, feeling a new sense of agency and awareness. The desert was still vast, still unpredictable, but she carried the lessons of the night with her: courage, patience, strategy, and the importance of human connection. Every step forward was a testament to resilience. Every glance at the horizon, a reminder of the balance between caution and action. As they walked together into the approaching evening, the woman allowed herself a quiet reflection. She had survived the night, confronted the unknown, and emerged stronger and wiser. The ridge, the shadows, and the approaching figures had tested them both. But the clarity and perspective gained from the ordeal would guide her in the days ahead. The desert, harsh and beautiful, had offered lessons she would carry for the rest of her life. The warrior remained at her side, constant presence of strength and calm. They moved through the desert in silence, each step deliberate, each glance a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed and what remained. The night had revealed danger, courage, and the unexpected bonds that could form under the weight of survival. The woman understood that she was not only stronger than she had believed, but also capable of navigating the world with newfound awareness and resilience as the sun finally sank below the horizon, casting the desert in soft twilight. The woman and the warrior found a place to rest, safe for the first time in days. She breathed deeply, feeling the tension of the night release from her body, and allowed herself a quiet moment of gratitude. The danger had passed, but the lessons would remain. Etched into her mind like footprints in the sand, the warrior glanced at her. A small, approving nod, acknowledging her courage, determination, and growth. Together, they watched the desert darken, the stars appearing one by one. A quiet testament to survival, human resilience, and the strength found in unexpected connections. And in that still, expansive moment, the woman understood that her journey was far from over. But she carried with her the courage, wisdom, and insight needed to face whatever lay ahead. The night had tested them. The ridge had threatened them, and the pursuers had forced them to confront the unknown. Yet through it all, they had survived, learned, and grown. The desert remained vast and wild, but they had found clarity in the chaos, strength in fear, and connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. The story of the wounded woman and the Apache warrior who found her reached its close with reflection. Courage and the knowledge that survival often reveals more than just endurance, it reveals the character, resilience, and humanity within. And as the first light of dawn promised a new day, they rose together, ready to move forward into the desert with hearts steadied by experience, minds sharpened by the night's lessons, and a bond forged in the shadows of danger and survival.